In part 1 of this lecture, we spoke about the theory behind the Ajax call to the server. In this part, we're going to speak about the actual practice of it and show you some code to do it. So right now I'm located in lecture 57, so that's lecture folder 57, and I'm looking at actually quite a few files here. And there's a couple of new files that I want you to pay attention to. Number one is ajaxutils.js. And this is the file which is going to give us the JavaScript in order to make those Ajax calls. So we kind of separated it into a separate file so we could see the Ajax procedure in its entirety and then just use it inside the script.js. Notice that in HTML, the index.html, I placed the Ajax utils.js above js/script.js is because script.js uses things inside of Ajax utils.js, which means that I actually have them, I have to have them loaded in the browser already before I start using them inside. So that's why inside script.js, that's why I placed them above that. Now, unlike previous examples where we had the web page click and say hello to whoever was the name that was in the text box, this time we want to click and say hello and get the name of the person we want to say hello to from the server. And for that, I actually have something, a little data file in the server. It's sitting inside the data folder in name.txt, and all it is just says Yakov Haikin. There's nothing else to it. It's just simple text file. And I want to verify that I can access or grab that file or the data from that file through the browser while my browser sync is running by simply putting the URL in and saying data, that's the data folder, and it's name.txt. If I say press enter, and I see that that's exactly what gets returned. It's a very simple two-word string. So we could close that for now. Okay, so let's close the file explorer in Sublime Text and let's go to our ajaxutils.js. So the first thing I want you to notice is that I'm using the iffy, the immediately invoked function expression, in order to wrap my entire code. So it comes from all the way here, if I scroll down, all the way here. And I'm passing it the window object, that's my global object, and that's how we remember it right here, global. And then what I'm doing is I'm setting up a namespace for my utility. So this is Ajax utils, and all it is just an empty object. So I can then attach things that I want to expose to the outside world. And you could see the very first function here is not attached to my Ajax utils, which means that when I expose Ajax utils to the outside world, meaning outside of this iffy, this function will not be directly available to the user of Ajax utils. Okay, so let's go over what this function does first of all. Well, it says it returns an HTTP request object. And what it does is it checks what type of object is available to us. Now, the very first if right here is the most important one because this is the most current object or the most current version of the Ajax object there is. The rest of them are kind of for the old browser. So window.activex object, that's something old Internet Explorer browsers used and really is not used anymore. And it's if you wanted to, you could really probably take out this whole thing out of here. Very few Microsoft Explorer browsers out there that are that old. And the last thing is just in case there's a browser out there that's going to access this that does not support Ajax at all, which means this object will not be available, neither will this object be available, we're going to go ahead and pop up a message, an alert here on window object, which is what this global is pointing to. And we'll just say Ajax is not supported, not necessarily the best message to return, but it's good enough. It's probably never going to happen anyway. And instead of the object, we'll just return null. So point is, this is that object that we could use to make requests, and we're creating here a new XML HTTP request object. And this is what we're going to use in our main function that we're going to write in a minute, we're going to see in a minute. And the reason we really pulled it out into a separate function is because it's just easier to put all these if statements in a separate place so we don't have to deal with it right in line with everything else. Okay, so let's take a look at the main function that we really care about. So that function is attached to Ajax utils. As you can see, I'm defining it as Ajax utils.sendGetRequest. And what we're going to do in this function is we're going to send a GET request to the server. So here's how this function is defined. There's the function right there. And I could see that I really need to put actually a semicolon at the end because this is just an expression, right? Expression of the function. Okay, so let's see what this function is expecting as parameters. Number one is expecting the request URL. Well, that makes sense. We need to know where to request, where to go to make that GET request on the server. So that's the URL. And we'll need a response handler function. So after the server responds, the response handler function is what is going to handle the result of what the server returns. Okay, so those are the two arguments we expect to be passed into this function. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that request object, and this is just that function we just spoke about, this request object right here. So we basically are going to get this new XML HTTP request object. So once we're done with that, once we get this request object, we're saving it in this local variable, and then we're setting this request object's onReady state change to another function. So onReady state change is the different stages in the network communication between the browser and the server. And we're going to see that in a minute. So what we're doing in this function is we're calling this handle response. And the handle response function is passed our request, this request object, and is passed the response handler as well. So when the server comes back with a response, this is the function that's going to get called. Every time there's a change in communication state, including the very final one that we're completely ready and here's your final response, this is the function that's going to get called. But we're not done setting up the request. The other thing we need to do is actually go ahead and make the open command with a GET request. So that's the type of request we want. That's the method of our request. We're going to pass it the URL, and we're going to make sure to say true here. And if you pass false here, it will make this request a synchronous request, which means the browser will freeze and wait for the response before doing anything else. And we don't want that. We want this request to be asynchronous. In other words, the second this request is made, we want the browser to continue operating. So in the last step here is actually to go ahead and send the request. So all of these lines right here were really just to set up the parameters of the request, what it's going to be like. And this line right here, the last line, is actually the one that executes the request and sends it to the server. The reason we're passing a null here is because if this were a post request, our parameters, request parameters, would not be part of the request URL, as you remember from the previous lecture, but it actually would be part of the body of the request. And this is where you put the body of the request. So if you wanted to have name value pairs for the request parameters, you would put that string right here, or probably save it in an object and then kind of paste that whole thing in here. Now let's take a look at our handle response function that we provided here. So the handle response function, as you can see, takes our original request object and the response handler function that our client, meaning our user, whoever is using this whole library, this whole Ajax util library, is providing for us. So we're kind of doing some kind of nitty-gritty work that they wouldn't have to do anymore. Number one is request.ready state. We want to make sure there's 4 states in this request.ready. And number one, we want to make sure we're in the last state. So it is ready to go. We don't have any other lower level network communications going on. And what they are is really not important, but what is important is that you have to check whether or not it's ready state 4. That's number one. And number two is we want to check that our request.status is 200. And this 200 is that response status code that we spoke about previously. So 200 means everything's fine, and here comes your response. And if those two conditions are true, only then should we then take the response handler, that is the function that the user of this library provided for us, and then we could go ahead and pass it the request that the user of this library will start pulling out of this request the response of the server. So that is how this response handler is being used. The last but not least is we want to expose this utility to the global object so we can actually use it. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the name of it a little bit. We'll say global dot, and we'll use the $, because we want to be all fancy, obviously. $, Ajax util. So just like jQuery uses $, we'll also use $, as part of our variable. So $, Ajax utils, that's what's going to be exposed to the global object, is going to be equal to our Ajax utils, that is the local objects right here in this IFI, in this immediately invoked function expression. Now, I hope you're wondering, at least a little bit, as to why this crazy setup is being made right here. On ready state change, we're passing it a function expression, so we're not executing this function, we're just passing the value of this function, not the return value, but just the value of the function object, and we're setting it to this property on ready state change. And inside of that, we're calling handle response, and that is what is going to get executed, since you could see the parentheses around it. Why not simply erase this and happily call well, we're not going to be able to fit in one line here, but happily called of this function right here. Why not have onReadyStateChange equal to handle response? Well, first of all, we need to equal it to a function value, not the return of the function. So this would have to go away. You can't really pass parameters into a function value. Only when you're executing the function can you pass parameters into it. And we're not quite ready to execute this function. We just want its value. Well, if we did that, this function right here wouldn't really have the request or the response handler available. Well, one way we could take care of it, and unfortunately, and you'll see why I'm saying unfortunately, a lot of people do take care of it, is by doing this. We could just take this line out of here and make it a little bit more global. And now our request is available everywhere. So it doesn't have to be part of these parameters, part of these arguments. We could just pull it out of the global part outside of this function. And obviously we need to take care of this as well to make it valid syntax. So let's take a look as to what we've done. What will happen now? Let's say somebody on the page clicks some button that invokes this send get request. This will go ahead and use the request that already has been gotten right here, which seems pretty good. We'll assign handle response to our onReadyStateChange, that's that function, and go ahead and make the request. The only thing is this handle response also really wants, at least in our case, wants the response handler function, and we're not passing that. But that's easily remedied by just saying var my handle response or my handler is equal to, and we will just equal it to this, right? So in order to do that, we could just say this is equal to null. And once we're done, we could just say my handler is equal to response handler. Okay, so now it's all complete. So at this point, this handle function, handle response, will be able to get the request and will also be able to get the response handler. So we really don't have to have these arguments to this function. The problem is that this whole thing is being called asynchronously. Remember what asynchronous means? It means that more than one thing could be executing at a time, which means once we send this request off and the server is waiting to respond, it could wait 2-3 seconds before it responds. Well, meanwhile, either the user or some other JavaScript process can call this again. And if it calls it again, it's going to end up using the same request object as we used for the previous request. And therefore, they will crisscross, get confused, and the response you're going to get is probably not the response that you were waiting for. And what you will have is what is called in computer science a race condition. In other words, there's some code that's going to be erasing another piece of code, and whoever wins is going to override this with its data, but the second one will never be able to get to it or will give you the wrong data. So this is really going to be a gigantic mess. So let's go ahead and do a bunch of undos and put it back the way it was. So now we're ready to see how we're actually going to use this library in our script.js. And that's what we're going to do in part 3 of this lecture.